Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Roundtable. It's September 2017. My name is Allie Tharp. I'm the Programs Manager for the UU Ministry for Earth and UU Young Adults for Climate Justice. And this webinar is co-produced with the Ministry for Earth and with the Green Sanctuary Program. I'd like to introduce Karen. Hello. And our guest speaker today is Candice Bernd. And Candice is a staff editor and reporter with Truth Out, and she has been doing investigative research in a series about toxic prisons in the United States. And Candice also helped co-produce a documentary called Don't Frack with Denton, and helped to pass a fracking ban in Denton, Texas. So Candice has a lot of experience with environmental justice, and we are blessed to have her join us today. So go ahead and take it away, Candice.
Thanks so much, Allie. Yeah, again, just thanks everybody for inviting me. I'm just really, really happy to hear that you guys are really interested in this topic, for one thing. Yeah, again, just to start, I live in North Texas. Denton is a little north of Dallas. And yeah, I work remotely for Truth Out. And for the past, I think it's been a year and 3 months or so now, we've been working in a collaborative investigative series that partnerships with another publication called Earth Island Journal to research this issue that we sort of colloquially say toxic prisons, but a more academic term is prison ecology. And that's how a lot of activists, a lot of academics sort of come at the issue. But it's really just the idea simply of the environmental impacts of mass incarceration and of the prison system. And again, I'm just really so happy to hear that everybody is interested in the subject, because while some academics and activists have been paying attention to this, it hasn't really been on the radar of the wider public. And that is just sort of starting to change. They're sort of starting to become more and more, it's starting to get more and more highlighted, you know, for a broader audience. But I still don't think it's really, you know, receiving as much attention as it deserves. And that's almost understandably, because when we think about mass incarceration, it does seem almost reasonable to prioritize the environmental impacts of that sort of things near the bottom of our list, because when we think about it typically through a human rights lens, right? Like we think about the straight up abuses that we know happen in prisons, prison slavery, slave wages, you know, prison guard abuse, sexual abuse, solitary confinement, these awful, horrible things that we know go on in prisons every day in this country. And that a lot of reporters, a lot of, you know, investigators, researchers have been working, you know, overtime to expose over the last few years. And so, yeah, when we think about, well, why are we talking about environmental impacts and how important is that when we think about all these other egregious things that are happening? Well, in my research, we actually found that these issues of prison toxicity can and have killed prisoners inside. There are a few examples of that I'll get into. But even in cases where prison toxicity hasn't been necessarily lethal, it is just one more thing that we heap on top of prison populations that are dealing with all these abuses. It's just one more injustice. In this case, it's an environmental injustice that we subject prison populations to while they are dealing with all these other issues. And so I'll start by going through a number of ways that this intersection between, you know, environmental justice and mass incarceration, we sort of look at it. It happens in sort of both ways. Like, not only do prisons have an effect on the environment, but the environment in which prisons place have an effect on prisoners. So it's a two-way street, essentially. But just to start, I'll talk about how prisons are located and typically sited in this country, which we have done a lot of work on in our first article about this. basically the case is, and this may be obvious to some folks if you have a background working on prison issues, but that prisons are basically sited or located in on lands or in places that are the least desirable in this country. It really runs the gamut. Most commonly, you're going to find prisons on the cheapest land next to your local landfill. Like so often, if it's not a more toxic site, it's simply been placed, at a dump site or at a landfill. In fact, one famous jail, Rikers Island, is basically on top of a toxic waste dump and has been sinking. Some people know about that, but yeah, I mean, that jail is thankfully being closed, but that's one of the more famous examples. But they can, it gets much more serious than that. We have so many examples of prisons, more than 500 or so, being located within a mile or within 3 miles of a Superfund cleanup site, a site that's been, reclaimed by the EPA as so toxic it's inhabitable, and is, especially funded to be reclamated, basically. So yeah, a lot of prisons are located next to Superfund sites. We have found them next to coal ash dumps. I don't know if some people joined the call from Pennsylvania, but I saw some people from Pennsylvania on the list. There is a prison in LaBelle, Pennsylvania, that is next to a coal ash dump site, and has been. It's like right across the street. Like here's the coal ash dump, and then just across the road is the prison. So it's literally, the prisoners are inhaling that coal ash dump, and they're captives to it. They can't move. They don't have a choice. The way other communities do. So coal ash dumps is another example. A lot of times it's just in the industrial zone of a city. And that can be all sorts of, so when we talk about fence line communities, right? Like we've been thinking about fence line communities in Houston, Texas, located next to all the refineries that got impacted by Harvey lately. Prison populations are definitely included in those fence line communities. Oftentimes the prisons are right in the industrial row where all the refineries are, or where a certain plant is, whether it be an LNG plant or any other kind of mass refinery like that. So oftentimes these prisons are located in just the most polluted sites in the country. And the regulators, the BOP, they do this with basically no review. Like they're basically getting away with not including the impacts, the potential impacts that these toxic sites would have on prisoners in what they're supposed to do under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. They're supposed to be reviewing this, and checking these locations. And they do this. They go through NEPA and they show what the prison, how it could impact the local environment. But more often than not, what they say is that the prison is just going to have, it's just going to be a boon to the local economy. It's going to create jobs and do that kind of thing. And that's what they focus on. And their focus on that is one reason why they get away with locating all of these prisons in the worst toxic places. Because they just say, oh, well, because it's going to create jobs, it's fine. But what they don't even consider is the impacts on prisons. So they will consider, for instance, the environmental justice impacts on the surrounding communities, local communities who are often communities of color, lower income, who are typically more vulnerable to these types of impacts. We know they will weigh those concerns for those populations. But they won't weigh the concerns on the prison population inside itself, which is the exact same demographic, typically more low-income communities of color that we know. So they've just been able to completely not consider that at all. And I'm really happy to say that our reporting, combined with some of the activism of groups that are working on these issues, has pushed them more to do so. So that's been really great. So that's one point. So prisons are located at incredibly toxic sites. And before I go to the next point, I'll just point out, like, to circle back to what I was saying about how this has killed prisoners. For instance, you know, in California, we pointed out how, because in the Central Valley, a lot of these prisons are located at these really risky sites that are vulnerable to valley fever. If anybody knows what that is, it's a fungal fever, and it actually disproportionately affects African Americans more so than other races, just genetically, purely genetically. It's just one of those things. But in California, valley fever has killed 50 prisoners in the valley prisons there. One thing that I wrote about, which isn't necessarily site specific in terms of it being located at a toxic site, but we think about it when we think about this intersection, is in Texas, in the state prisons, the prisons operated by our state corrections agency here, they typically, the majority of them don't have air conditioning in the cell blocks. And we know that climate change is bringing on more and more heat waves. And in 2011, we experienced a really brutal heat wave here, and it actually killed 10 prisoners from heat stroke and hyperthermia inside the prison system. So we know that climate change is only going to bring more heat waves. And basically, we know that the corrections agencies are basically making this cost benefit analysis where they're just kind of, it's sort of like how a car company chooses to not fix a defective product that they know is going to kill people. Like the state prison agency is doing the same thing. They're just making a decision that by not retrofitting their prisons for AC, they just know they're going to have prisoners die as a result of that. And that's the decision they're making. So these intersections, when we think about them, do have that kind of heavy of a toll where deaths have been involved. But moving on to the other thing I want to talk about is prisons are also point source polluters. Prisons themselves have impacts on the environment that environmentalists often don't think of. Like, we usually think about private profit, right? We usually think about corporations and companies who are emitting, you know, toxic waste and things into the air. We often don't think about the government or the state as one of the primary perpetrators of this, but prisons are huge government purveyors of pollution. They have serious impacts on emissions. We know that one prison was fined in excess of the state regulation because its boiler got broken in such a way that it emitted excess particulate matter in violation of the state regulations. Prisons have a lot of traffic associated with them. So like when we think about things like fracking, for instance, we know that fracking brings all these trucks in and out of communities, these heavy, heavy trucks that crack the roads and choke up the neighborhood. And prisons are the same way. There's just a ton of traffic associated with the prison industry. When you think about what it takes to keep, you know, a facility, a prison of that size that, you know, incarcerates so many people running, it takes a lot. One of the most common violations we found in our research is sewage issues. There are a lot of polluted sewage runoffs that happen at prisons across the nation. That's just a really, really common one. And yeah, so just all of these different aspects, you know, prisons themselves are polluting. And then I just wanted to circle back to just the idea again about environmental justice and how so often when we think about environmental justice communities, prison populations are left out or not really thought of. There's always just this emphasis from environmental activists about fence line communities or frontline communities, the people who are impacted, yet, you know, when things like Hurricane Harvey happen, one of the first populations that we don't think about is, you know, what happens to the prisoners. So yeah, those are kinds of some of the main intersections that I wanted to talk about. There are some other there are some other things that we can think about concerning labor. Labor has been a really interesting intersection when we think about this. Like, if some people know about how the West Coast is just on fire right now and has been for a while, like it's raining ash in Oregon and just all of this crazy stuff because of how much the woodlands are just burning over there. Well, they use prison labor to fight some of the fires in California. Furthermore, Hurricane Irma in Florida right now, they're using prisoners to help in some of the recovery efforts unpaid. So, that's interesting when we think about prison labor. Prisoners often will do work that is environmentally risky or toxic without any protection, like they don't have masks or things like that. Like they can often get away with just very blatant labor violations when it comes to prison labor. I mean, obviously a big one is the fact that in some states they don't even pay them, so it's slavery. But they can, when it comes to like OSHA and things like that, like they can just get away with making them do whatever without any sort of like environmental hazard protection against them. And again, just lastly, just climate change. That big one to circle back to again is just, in states, Texas isn't the only state where they don't have AC in state prisons. We know more heat waves are going to kill prisoners, and then, climate change is going to bring more floods. We've seen such an intense hurricane season this year that, one of the things I reported on is basically in Harvey, after Harvey came, and it made its second landfall in Beaumont, and everybody saw how devastated Beaumont was. It completely lost power and water. The whole city, the water got cut off. What happened in 6 prisons there, so it's a federal BOP prison camp that consists of a high, low, and medium security units, and then there's 3 other state-run prisons in Beaumont. Had to deal with these really egregious conditions after the hurricane cut off the water and the power there. What happened is, without any water, without any power, the federal prisons typically have AC. And what's more dangerous about that is the acclimation issue. Like, when you have AC and you're used to AC, when it gets cut off on you and the rapid temperature difference, like that's what kills people. And in the cases where men have died, it's typically when they become transferred from a county jail, which has AC, into a state prison that doesn't. It's the body's ability not to be able to acclimate. And so that's what happened. A lot of these federal prisoners are like suddenly dealing with these spiking temperatures of 100, where, the day before they were in cool, humane conditions. And then without any water, they had serious sewage issues. The officials were trying to bring in porta potties, but the porta potties were backing up. The water was compromised. It basically was the floodwaters from outside. And so the prison guards were telling the men inside that they were going to turn on the water for 30 minutes a day, only to allow toilets to be flushed. But they were only allowing the men to drink 2 bottles of water a day. And so some of the men got so desperate inside that they chose to defecate into bags in order to conserve the water that they had in their toilets, which they then drank. They resorted to drinking. So, that kind of thing is just, that's what goes on inside of prisons when something like a hurricane hits. After Hurricane Katrina, we know in a jail there in New Orleans, men were up to their chest in floodwaters, thought they were going to die, and the prison officials completely abandoned them. And in terms of that toxic water issue, the men drinking toxic water in the Beaumont federal prison, one thing I highlighted when I was reporting on that is that unfortunately is not even the first time prisoners in Texas and elsewhere were drinking contaminated water. What's so egregious about this is it's actually very, very common for prisoners to be drinking contaminated water, regardless of whether or not a crazy natural disaster like a hurricane ever hits the prison. In fact, there's another prison unit called Wallace Pack that was the subject of a federal lawsuit. It was a class action lawsuit that the prisoners won there over the AC issue. But in addition to that AC issue, for 10 years, the prisoners there were drinking water that was laced with between 2.5 and 4.5 times the amount of arsenic levels deemed safe by the EPA. So they drank that for 10 years. So, it's likely, which arsenic is a carcinogen. So it's hard to sort of quantify like what exactly the cancer risks are, but it's significant, I would say, at the very least. And in fact, that prison, Wallace Pack, which was deemed unconstitutionally hot by a federal judge, in their scramble to relocate to evacuate some of the prisoners from the flood zone and other areas, they actually ended up moving some of the prisoners to Wallace Pack. So they moved them into unconstitutional conditions. But yes, and I bring up the water contamination issue because this was actually it's not a site-specific thing, but it was one of the most common violations we found. And what we did in our reporting is we FOIA'd some databases from the EPA. So at the national level, the EPA will fine or regulate federal prisons for environmental violations that run the gamut. And so we basically FOIA'd their enforcement and compliance section to find out and look at all of the different violations that have been levied against federal prisons over the last 5 years. And what we found is that the most common federal environmental regulation that prisons were violating across the country came under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the most common violation for prisons is violations of federal safe drinking water standards. That's the most common thing across the country. So yeah, we found numerous instances of water contamination. There's another prison in Texas called Eastham, which we found lead and copper violations. So yeah, water contamination, very, very pervasive in prisons, which is very unfortunate. So yeah, I think that's sort of the different aspects of prison ecology that I wanted to sort of emphasize the most. I kind of wanted to start talking about, okay, so this is a pervasive issue, it's a systematic issue, it's an institutional issue. What do we do about it? How do we plug in? I think one of the very interesting things about the groups that are working on this, the group of activists, there's one primary organization. They're the Prison Ecology Project. It's actually an arm of the Human Rights Defense Center. And they have a campaign called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And in June, we had a conference, a gathering of activists from across the country who are sort of working on this, not just activists, but academics and researchers like myself, who gathered actually here in my town in Denton, because they were targeting a prison in Fort Worth called Carswell, which is located next to a Superfund site. But that's probably the most central primary organization in the country that is working on this. They are a collection of individuals, but they're going to be your most central way to get involved if you want to work on this, I guess, from a national perspective. But one thing I wanted to walk people through is more locally. So how does this apply to where you live? A lot of you folks may be environmental organizers just where you live. You might be targeting certain extraction projects or certain facilities that you know are point source polluters. And I wanted to talk about how you find out, like, let's say you already have a campaign going where you've targeted a certain facility. How do you find out whether or not there might be a prison nearby? I wanted to share with folks a little bit of this tool that the EPA just came out with. In fact, they just updated it's been an existing tool for a while, but they recently updated it as a result of pressure from reporting and activism to include prisons as a part of it. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and kind of walk you through a little demonstration of what I'm going to walk you through this tool really quick. But before I do that, I also want to share some links with you before I forget. Just about the campaign I'm talking about. Let me see if I can't really move that. So here's this organization I'm talking about. Let's see if I can just chat it with you. Okay, I can't seem to find out how to do that at the moment. Oh wait, yes I can. This is this organization. I just shared that link there for everybody. Okay, great. And then I'm gonna share with you this tool. It's called EJ Screen, or Environmental Justice Screen, and it's a computer tool you can use from the EPA. So there's the link to that. So Allie shared one of the articles I wrote about this issue dealing with immigrant detention. And I wanted to use that as an example of what I'm talking about. So there's a liquefied natural gas facility that indigenous folks and other environmental justice and just environmental organizers in general have been targeting in Tacoma, Washington. If you guys have heard of like the Puyallup tribe, I hope I pronounced that right, have been doing some actions there because this all used to be their land. Anyways, I found the address of the proposed LNG sites. And what I did was I plugged that address here into the EJ Screen tool. So right here, I searched this address and it pulled it up. So that's these two cross marks. That's the location of the liquefied natural gas plant. So then what you can do, and this is fairly easy to use, you just go here where it says add maps, and then you put additional maps, and it drops you down this menu, and you can click prisons. So you click prisons, and then it shows you all the prisons nearby. So it shows you like this is what your key looks like. This right here, this little dot, I know it's kind of small, is the Northwest Detention Center, which I wrote a lot about. And you can see that's where that's located. So it's in the ballpark. The LNG plants are still pretty far away, but it's a safe bet that those emissions are going to be impacting these folks right here. Now, this whole area is an industrial area of Tacoma. Constitution Bay is what it's called. It's a port and a lot of shipping and a lot of trains come in and out of here. But what's great about this tool is you can not only see the proximity of the LNG plant to the prison, but you can come over here, and again, you go to add maps, and you go to additional maps, and then you can go sites reporting to the EPA. And that'll bring you up this little happy menu right here. And right here, you've got sites reporting to the EPA, Superfund. So you can check this box, and the key is gonna be a little orange box. You check it, and then it brings you up the Superfund site. Boom, the Superfund site is right here, which is a lot closer to the prison. So now you're looking at a prison that's got LNG plant, a Superfund site. Okay, let's look at toxic releases. Let's click this box. So the key will be these little blue boxes. We'll click that, and it should bring that up. Oh, wow. This prison is just surrounded by a bunch of this. Okay, let's click water discharges. Boom, it adds it there. That's because this whole area is just an industrial polluted wasteland. Air pollution, let's check this. And we can just slowly see, you know, how polluted this area is and in proximity to this prison. So what I suggest people do is if you've already got a campaign against you've already targeted a facility or an extraction site or whatever it is, a fracking site, a pipeline, I don't know. You can just try to pinpoint an address and plug it in here and then locate how close a prison might be to that issue. And you got a safe bet that, those prisoners might be being affected by some of the health concerns that go along with that. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about, let's go here, is right, like plugging into, so you've located your prison, right? Oh my gosh, there's a prison that's super close to this refinery that we've been working on, like fighting for a year. What do I do? Well, the best thing to do is you want to try to plug directly in with prisoners themselves. Like the best thing to do, and I encourage anybody, even if there's no relation, you should really I feel like if you've got time to write a congressman, you have time to write a prisoner. And honestly, the prisoners need your letters a little bit more than the congressmen do. Just going to put that out there. I encourage everybody to write prisoners and to get a pen pal. But how do you plug in with those prisoners? How do you even establish communication in the first place? The best way to go is through families. Usually in every state, there is some kind of an organization that you can find that is a organization specifically for the families of incarcerated loved ones. In Texas, there's a big one called TIFA. It's called the Texas Inmate Families Association, and it's who I've gone through to do a lot of reporting to get in touch with just wives of husbands, just family members of loved ones. And if you touch base with the families can put you in touch with the prisoners. So they can give you, prisoners have a number. They can give you their number, the address to write them. And, even if you want to establish phone contact, they can help you do that. But basically you can begin to bring these concerns to families and, just ask them, hey, there's this refinery that's really close to the prison. Have you ever heard your husband or your son or your daughter, whoever, talk about, having a lot of coughing, or if it's been, if they've had health issues related to pollution, or if they're having any sort of impacts from these. Families will usually be able to tell you if they've heard complaints like that, or they'll be able to put you in touch with prisoners so that you might ask them yourself. But so that's what I recommend is that your first point of contact, you really want to try to find what the organization that serves the families is. And that's your best bet as a way in to prisoners. And then, the other thing I would just emphasize is that, if you begin to find this, you begin to talk to families, you begin to sort of figure out that, there are impacts going on from prisons on prisoners, or the reverse, like you're finding that a prison itself is actually doing a lot of polluting damage to a local community, and there's like an already existing campaign against another point source polluter. Like, let's say your local Sierra Club or your local 350 chapter is already targeting some point source polluter, some extractive site. It'd be good for local folks to encourage those organizations to bring the prison into that campaign, to make that part of the talking points, to just help focus energy on that. Because when we think about these things, we so often forget the prison population. So when we talk about there's this extracting project and it's disproportionately affecting these low income fence line communities around it, not only just saying that, but saying and also the prisoners who live here in this prison that's really super close. Just not forgetting that prison populations are in fact part of those fence line communities. So yeah, encouraging already existing campaigns around sites to include the prison aspect in what they're doing, basically. And that's doing a lot right there. If you just convince a big NGO to start talking about this, or start making this a part of the campaign, I think that's a huge victory. Another thing that maybe not everybody is so inclined to get into, because it's a little bit of a kind of heavy, like data research. Not everybody has the capacity for that, but some people really like it. But we've been talking about different ways to try to paper wrench these prisons, which is just trying to use the legal system basically against a proposed prison. Right now, that Tacoma, Washington prison that I talked about, that was an immigrant detention center. That immigrant detention center is just one, like we know right now what's happening under the Trump administration is obviously the Trump administration is trying to expand immigrant detention very rapidly so that it can carry out its violent, immigrant agenda. So, if he wants to expand the immigrant detention system, there's going to be a lot more detention centers being built in the next few years. Well, we know under federal law, just like prisons, any federal detention center like that is gonna have to go through the NEPA process. Again, that's the National Environmental Policy Act. It's gonna have to have something called an environmental impact study done, which again looks at the environmental impacts of a federal project. And so often they just can get away with sort of glossing over real environmental impacts. But what we can do is we can try to contest it. So let me just back up really quick. There's a lot of strange kind of, when it comes to immigrant detention, it gets really confusing because we know that under the Obama administration initiated something called a programmatic environmental assessment, which is just a very broad environmental assessment for the entire family detention apparatus. So these concern basically 3 detention centers, which are specialized to incarcerate children, women and children who are immigrants, which I've reported a lot. 2 of them are in Texas. And yeah, one of them is in Karnes County, which is easily one of the most fracked counties in Texas. So it's in the heart of Gasland, and when you go around there, you can see it's completely surrounded by frack sites. And so yeah, there's and then when we think about the fact that there are children in the facilities, we have children whose lungs are more vulnerable to particulate matter, things like that. But yeah, to go back to the environmental impact statement issue. So that was done for this very particular slice of the immigrant detention picture, which the Obama administration pursued. But from what I have found, for the larger immigrant detention system, there hasn't been a large programmatic assessment for a long time. In fact, one hasn't been done since it was the INS, which was way, way back. And in fact, a couple of organizations are suing over this. It's kind of the same idea about how you've heard about people suing for NEPA about the border wall, like saying that they're trying to build the border wall and it hasn't gone through proper environmental assessment. It's kind of the same idea for detention centers. The Center for Biological Diversity is suing over the fact that there hasn't been this proper broad programmatic environmental assessment for immigrant detention in general. It's only been done for a slice of that issue, the family detention portion. And so not only do they have to have these broad assessments, but we also have project level assessments, right? So for each particular facility, for each particular detention center, they're going to have to go through a review and see how each one, impacts the environment. And this has been kind of piecemeal. It was done for one site in Dilley, Texas, which, they glossed over all of these concerns. In fact, the University of Texas has an immigrant clinic. It's a law clinic. And they also have an environmental law clinic. And the clinics teamed up together and wrote a letter to DHS Secretary, who at the time was Jay Johnson, trying to say that, we need a more robust environmental study to be done here because you're ignoring all of these issues. You're ignoring, they brought up fracking. They brought up a range of concerns that the original EIS didn't address. And so this is one thing we can be thinking about. Like if they're going to be building a new immigrant detention center or a new prison, you can be trying to research ways that their environmental assessment falls short and try to even sue. I mean, if people are into that, or convince a large NGO which has the resources and the capacity to sue them over not doing the process right, which is what I say when I mean paper wrenching, like just trying to throw a wrench in their process because so easily they just kind of file the paperwork and then they're done with it. But in fact, they don't actually weigh the real concerns. Or, you have cases where they're contracted between, a private prison company. And in those cases, sometimes they're not done at all, which is an easy lawsuit. So things like that are one way we can think about, especially I bring this up in regard to immigrant detention just because there's a real drive to expand immigrant detention at the moment right now under the Trump administration. But yeah, that's all more of a sort of like very legalistic, like you want to research and get your, if you don't have the capacity to sort of do that yourself, you want to partner with organizations that sort of have the legal capacity to kind of engage with that sort of a tactic. But, otherwise, like the best, and then if you're not sort of targeting using that legal tactic, and you're going back to what I sort of said at the beginning, you're just sort of trying to partner with families, actually get in touch with prisoners themselves, and partnering with environmental activists, you want to just target the officials who have power, which in this case is pretty clear cut. It's going to be, either the Bureau of Prisons, in the case of a federal prison, or your state corrections agency, whatever that be. Here in Texas, it's the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But these are the people who literally hold all the power, and they're the only ones that can do anything to help conditions. After Harvey impacted the prisoners in Beaumont, it's the women who are the wives of those guys there in those prisons are just desperate to try to get the BOP to alleviate the conditions in there. They have to push the BOP to do something about it because, when we think about hurricanes, so often we have the impulse to just donate. We want to just donate immediately to the organizations, help, give aid. We want to, give our money, give our food, our time, to the victims. But even the people who want to donate to help the prisoners in Beaumont, who are victims of Harvey, can't. You can't just give them donations or aid that way. You're not allowed to. They don't have the choice. They are literally, so one term we have been using to think about this intersection is climate captives. They're literally held captive to climate chaos in that sense, and they don't have the choice to move or to try to escape their situation. They can't even receive aid, so yeah, I mean, your targets are very clear cut. They're the people in power, and that's I think I hit the main bases I wanted to hit. How am I doing on time?
It's about time to move into questions and dialogue. So, yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, cool. So what I'll do is I will unmute everyone, and if we could just say thank you to Candice for sharing with us. And
yeah, thank you.
Thank
you.
much.
Really very informative. Wow. Very
So,
informative. Yeah. Real eye-opener.
So does anyone have questions? Earl?
Yeah, thank you very much. I've been aware of this issue, but not in such detail. And my question is, out here in the Bay Area, we have been fighting the Air Quality Management District, and we've been fighting Chevron, and we've had a lot of different battles that are similar to this. And what we're finding quite often is that in some cases, the regulatory agencies have been captured by the industry. I don't know to what extent that's true for the prison, the agencies that deal with the prisons, but certainly it is the case with many of the agencies that are supposed to be regulating the fossil fuel companies. And so we've been sort of changing our focus to some extent to bring more and more pressure on elected officials, and in some cases working with groups like Indivisibles and others to get the bastards out. And having gone through the Toxic Tour in Houston earlier this year, California is practically paradise in comparison to Texas and Louisiana too. And so my question for you has to do with to what extent does really working with the Bureau of Prisons work, or do you really need to make a stronger attack on the state legislature and also your congressional representatives?
Right. No, I actually love that you brought up that point, because I should have gotten to that and didn't. So I'm so glad you asked that question. And I'll answer it in sort of two parts. To go to the question about industry capture, absolutely. Yes. Here we have the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is notoriously known for being super captured. Yeah, and so they are the state agency that would be also regulating state prisons, which they haven't been and have been very neglectful. I can show you, actually, I meant to bring this up. I'm just going to screen share really quick.
She froze on my screen. Did she freeze?
TECQ. Okay. Oh, do you got it? Should I?
It just came up.
Okay, great. So this is we FOIA'd this database from TCEQ, and it shows the violations of at state prisons. Remember I mentioned the Wallace Pack unit that was found to be unconstitutionally hot and that the prisoners were drinking arsenic for 10 years? Well, here's all of these violations of the Pack unit on this database. So they were going in and finding Wallace Pack in violation for years. And yet still these prisoners, we know, were exposed to these levels of arsenic for more than 10 years. So this is slap on the wrist stuff. This wasn't properly handled. I mean, this is paperwork right here is what this is. But it didn't result in any tangible, change in the conditions for the prisoners at Wallace Pack. So, until a judge stepped in, until the legal system stepped in. So yeah, absolutely. Industry capture is going to be a part of this picture. It's still helpful to try to figure out, like it's still helpful to have the information from your regulator, whether it be the state or federal regulator, so that you can try to get a picture of the history of violations at a particular prison that you can do through FOIA. Or sometimes, if it's a really good state regulator, they'll have like a helpful online tool that you can search. But most don't. Most of the time you'll have to go through FOIA. But yeah, I mean, if you can FOIA request like the history of violations, of environmental violations at a particular prison, you can get a snapshot. Like if you do this for Wallace Pack, you can see, oh my gosh, there are like years of violations here, and you can kind of put together a picture. But to come around to the other part of what you're saying, working with the BOP, I sort of meant more like the BOP as a target, like they're your number one sort of sort of target of power. So yeah, I mean, you're really not going to get any traction in trying to sort of like work with the BOP. They are like resistant. And you're absolutely right. In fact, I can show you a concrete example of this in terms of like getting a congressman or something on board. A congressman is actually one of the most powerful voices in terms of prisons that you can leverage. With the Beaumont situation, for the prisoners there, after I wrote about it, I was really pleased that Congressman Lloyd Doggett used the report to demand answers from the BOP, like not just my report, but some other reports from the Houston Chronicle, but mine was one of them, that he sort of took this collection of reporting and went to the BOP and was like, what is going on in this prison? You know, I demand an explanation, like, you know, and so they are responding to him over that. So yeah, I mean, people in power like that, congressmen, you know, the BOP, like if it's families and, you know, grassroots activists coming at them, making demands, like they're gonna ignore you more. I mean, you know, that's their instinct. Their instinct and their impulse is gonna be to ignore you. And because they have the power, you know, they can, and so they will. But until somebody at that level, like a congressman, is coming in and saying like, hey, you know, this is absolutely egregious, we need to do something about this, then they'll feel like it's enough pressure that they're going to have to change something. But in terms of the BOP, I mean, you know, the congressman on his own can't change the conditions for the prisoners inside. Like the BOP has to. Like they're the only ones with power to actually concretely change the conditions for prisoners. So they are your primary target.
Can you repeat the acronym, what it stands for people less familiar, Candice?
The Bureau of Prisons is the federal agency that oversees federal prisons. Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, I mean, you definitely want to target, but, you know, often with congressmen and stuff like that, they are going to want very credible reporting of conditions inside. And in order to get that and to get that kind of picture, like you have to work with families. You have to get basically what you want to do. And this is so tough with prisons because they're such a fortress and you have to crack open like this mysterious, like, you know, like fortress, like it's so hard to communicate with the guys inside there. But your most credible evidence of, you know, terrible human rights abuses are going to come from the prisoners themselves. And you have to be careful because you don't want to rely on just one person's testimony, because a lot of people will write that off like, oh, well, if this one prisoner. But when you have multiple prisoners all describing the same conditions, they can't write that off, you know. And that's what we had in Beaumont. We had all of these prisoners describing the exact same thing. You know, they're only giving us 2 bottles of water. We have sewage backing up from our toilets, from our porta potties. Like we are gagging on the fumes of excrement, and there is water, you know, up to our ankles here. And we, you know, the temperatures are 100 degrees, and, you know, we're not getting a hot meal. We're only getting 1 bologna sandwich a day or whatever it is, you know. We haven't had clean laundry. Like when they're all describing those same conditions, they can't ignore that. And yeah, you got to plug in with the families in order to get that in the first place. But yeah, you want to target, absolutely, you're absolutely right. You want to target those kinds of stakeholders, those kinds of people, because the BOP, prisons, and your state corrections agency, whatever it is, has so much power to begin with. That's why they can get away with all this stuff. It's unfortunate, but sometimes the only way, you know, you have to fight fire with fire. Like you have to find like an equally powerful stakeholder to like challenge them. It's, yeah, because of just the nature of how power works, basically. But yeah, I mean, you're totally correct on those instincts on all of the fronts of that question.
Thank you.
I'm in Texas, and I didn't really realize until after Harvey how there's not air conditioning in all these facilities. I was shocked. But anyway, my question is, what percentage of the prison and immigration detention facilities are privately owned? I know it's not the majority. That's my opinion. That's my information that I got from somewhere. Those that are privately owned, and even the ones that are publicly owned, they're serviced by private corporations that are making a profit off of this business. And I know that the Quakers have an investment screen where they guide people who want to work on a divestment campaign with their faith organizations, other organizations, and they have a list of 6 companies that they recommend people divest from. I think a divestment campaign is an educational thing. I think it's hard to win sometimes, but it helps promote awareness. And I'm just wondering what you think about that as a way of pressuring reforms and change.
Yeah. On your first question, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know off the top of my head. That would be something I'd have to like Google really quick. But off the top of my head, I don't know what the percentage is of how many prisons are privately run. In terms of prisons, you're right. I don't think it's a majority. However, I'm not sure about this, but I would actually contest that when it comes to immigrant detention. It actually might be a majority when it comes to immigrant detention centers. At least a lot of them, a huge proportion, are privately contracted. But I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. But in terms of the divestment issue, yeah, I definitely think divestment is always a great strategy. When we talk about divestment, though, we can't just target divestment sort of on its own, because one of the things that influences how private prison companies operate are government mandates. For instance, bed quotas. And this was true under the Obama administration and going back. One of the things that influences how private prison corporations operate is the fact that there is a government mandate that they have to incarcerate X amount of individuals. It's called a bed mandate. And so as long as that government policy is in place, the private prison corporation is going to be, having to follow that guideline and having to operate with that under that stricture. So I think they have to be targeted together. I mean, of course, absolutely, everybody should pull their money out of private prison corporations. It kind of boggles the mind to imagine the people who are invested in these things to begin with. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to take them as two beasts that are sort of fundamentally entwined. The private prison company, that sector relies on that, on the government, needing their services, the government needing to contract with them, the government needing them to fulfill these quotas. Yeah, I think you got to do both.
I think so. And this is intersectional opportunity here, because I see Sodexo, and I think, isn't that the company that gets hotel contracts, convention contracts, college cafeteria contracts? Sometimes it's
right. I think I remember them from contracting food services in prisons, like cafeteria, like you're saying.
Yeah, so it's an opportunity to maybe mobilize college students that would be horrified and get them to pressure their administrations to drop the Sodexo contract.
And yeah, exactly. And another thing that college students often pay attention to is the fact that a lot of supplies for universities, school supplies, are made by prison labor. So like the desks and the chairs, like those chairs that are connected to those little desks in universities, a lot of those are made by prisoners, actually. Which is something college kids have been keying in on for a while and have had campaigns against in the past. So yeah, definitely.
So folks, we have just 20 more minutes. And so I think we can move into, feel free to keep asking Candice questions, but I want to move to some questions and dialogue for the full group. Karen, would you mind doing the screen share for that?
I need to leave at this time.
Who was that?
It was Terry.
Okay. Do you have any words you want to share before you go?
I do not. Thank you. It was very informative.
Pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Okay, so these are just small group conversation questions. One is, pretty basic to share your response to Candice's presentation. And secondly, if you find a prison near you is one of 589 located near Superfund sites or is dumping waste into the surrounding area, what might you seek to learn about to address these impacts, which we've already been diving into a bit. Candice spoke about that. So maybe let's focus on our reactions. If you have any thoughts about prisons, maybe there's one near you that you actually know about already. Let's talk about that. And the third is Angela Davis wrote that the prison has become a black hole into which the detritus of capitalism is deposited. Talk about whether that statement influences your understanding of environmental justice.
Well, I think it's been a great presentation and I appreciate it so much. Thanks for setting this up. Very informative.
Candice, I have a question about Beaumont, and I think you said that the situation is still somewhat ongoing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. We've gotten some response on it after some of the reporting, and also the wives, primarily wives of these prisoners they protested in Grand Prairie at a regional Bureau of Prisons office there. And so there's been some things, they've gotten power restored, they've gotten water restored. But what they're saying is that as a result of this, which is another really common environmental issue at prisons, there's black mold growth everywhere, all over the prison. And what she's telling me is that they're not really properly handling that. They're just sort of like painting over it and leaving it. And black mold can affect you, especially if you're already sensitive in terms of your lungs, if you already have medical issues concerning, if you're asthmatic or something like that, COPD, that's going to hugely affect you. So there's just different issues going on at the prison. Black mold growth is a huge one. But yeah, they're just, and the fact that they're saying, I'm still sort of working on getting the details of this, but they are saying that there is some retaliation going on against some of the prisoners there, who unfortunately their names have come out in some other people's reporting. I kept everybody anonymous in my reporting because I was really wary about that and really afraid of that, because that's a huge threat to prisoners. And that's something everybody needs to be aware of. If some prisoners, tell their story, they can be at risk to retaliation. Like if they are revealing these injustices going on inside and speaking out against abuses, and it comes out in the media or something like that, yeah, they can totally get retaliated against by prison guards in there. And some of that's been happening. One of the guys' names got out in the Houston Chronicle, and she's saying that his wife is saying that he's been dealing with some retaliatory acts after that happened. So yeah, it's still an evolving issue, and it's basically, it's still ongoing. But I just wanted to say something that I forgot to say about your number 3 here, about Angela Davis's statement. One way I do think the prison ecology issue sort of helps us think about environmental justice is it sort of contributes again to that overall the overall sort of politics and discourse of disposability that we've had in this country for a long time. In this case, we so often think about prisoners being disposed of, put into these black holes, as Angela Davis calls them. But literally, when we think about it from an environmental justice angle, just like the trash and the waste we put in our landfills we also treat prisoners as if they're literal trash or waste that we also dump in the same places. Like we just dump them off and disappear them. Like we literally dump them into these sites as if they are detritus, as if they are just disposable like trash. And yeah, I mean, it's again, it's just that framework of disposability.
One thing that came up for me is, as Unitarian Universalists, what does it mean to come at this issue from a faith grounding, or from as a faith institution, which are somewhat different. So I think that the mentality of treating prisoners as people who deserve whatever we put them through because they've been charged with a crime is really pervasive, and that is actually, when I was reading the reactions on Facebook to the stories about what was happening in Beaumont, there was such a tremendous level of crassness and people saying, well, they deserve it and things like that. And so it seems like the spiritual indifference to these lives is a huge matter, that faith organizations, people coming together, like Unitarian Universalists, believe in equity and human rights of every person, and have prison ministries existing, so there's things that we can do. And one thing that was mentioned in the chat from Dana is that there's a group called the Church of the Larger Fellowship that has a pen pal program and helps to give hope to prisoners, and so that's one organization that might be worth reaching out to if someone does go down this road of trying to address a prison situation. And also there's a Unitarian Universalist prison ministry called Black and Pink, which focuses on supporting LGBTQI prisoners. So these are two groups that relate to the UU faith and that may be allies in this kind of work.
Yeah, and there are actually a lot of prison ministries around the country. I know there's one in Dallas that I connected with over the Beaumont prison. There are a lot of ministries who focus on prisons in particular, who go to prisons to give sermon and to work with prisoners, and then who also work with prisoners when they come out. To reconnect with their faith, or maybe to just find faith for the first time and turn their life around, or whatever it is. Prison ministry is it's really common, and I definitely think those are great connections for UUs to be making.
Candice, do you know of prison ministries that have actually turned to advocacy on this issue? Because sometimes that can help in getting political officials to respond?
Yeah, well, the only one I can sort of talk about in terms of this intersection is that one in Dallas. There is a prison ministry. In fact, when I connected in with these wives, a few of them are based in Dallas. And when I met them, I first got invited into a Facebook group they created. One or two of them were starting to get these horrible messages from their husbands inside about what was going on. And they decided to create a Facebook group of connecting all with other wives, all of the wives together. And I got invited in on this group, and I started watching their conversations. And then the ones from Dallas said, okay, we're going to meet up tonight at this church in Dallas. And that's where I met them. So my first meeting of these ladies to start my reporting on this issue was in a church. And it was a church that does prison ministry issues. And the pastor at the church had served time himself. He said he'd served 8 years. And now he is a minister, and that's what he does. He goes into prisons and he gives sermons, and he also works with prisoners who come out. And yeah, they were pushing, he had gone to Beaumont and took pictures of the outside, did filming of the outside, and was working with these wives to try to get their message out. I don't know that he had targeted, like any congressman or anything like that, but they were just working very closely with these wives to get their stories out, and to go there and try to check things out and get connected in with the prisoners. So yeah, the church was a big part of that story. There's a photo in my Beaumont piece of these women that I talk about, and you can't really tell, but it's actually in that church. So.
Go ahead, Irene. I've already spoken.
Your first question, what was our personal response? And my personal response is thank you. It really is connecting some dots for me. And here in Florida, interestingly, after many years of the reverse, they increased the allocations for prisons this past year in our legislature, but not prison investigations. And the St. Pete Times, which is a nonprofit, well, they're not called the St. Pete Times anymore, the Times, is a nonprofit news organization, and they team with very often the Miami Herald. And they've done a lot of prison expose writing about other kinds of abuses. So while you were talking, I went out and did a search, and guess what? There is not one that mentions any of these issues. So what an opportunity to connect with primarily one reporter who does most of the prison reporting, the deep prison reporting, and see if we can't elevate this issue in people's airwaves, because I believe people would work on it if they had a presentation like yours that connected the dots. So thank you.
Definitely. You're welcome. Thanks for coming on and listening and being interested.
My quick question has to do with the Bay Area doesn't have this kind of overlap. I know that there are some god-awful things happening in Kern County that I've been connected with. Are you aware of any other places in California where you have this environmental prison overlap, or you have the prison in a place that's right on top? Because I know about the Valley Fever cases and some of the other things going on in Kern.
Yeah, I've got a note pulled up right here. The Victorville Federal Correctional Complex in San Bernardino County was built on a former Air Force base that's been designated a Superfund site.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's one. And then my colleague Zoe, who's also worked on this series, she did primarily most of the California reporting because she's based there in Berkeley. But again, just the Central Valley was a big focus of hers in terms of that valley fever that I was talking about that has killed 50 prisoners there. And in fact, they have moved prisoners out of certain prisons in the valley as a result of this because they've known it's been such a problem. But it didn't, it eventually took lawsuits in order to get that to happen, though, which is so often the case. A lot of these issues, really nothing happens until there is a lawsuit. Like Wallace Pack took a lawsuit. Like that Valley Fever issue took a lawsuit. Most of the time that's the case. But yeah, and then you mentioned Kern County. I don't remember us reporting on any specific prison in particular in Kern County, but I know Kern is one of the most fracked counties in California, and it's also one of the more lower income counties as well. So yeah, I mean, Kern, and again, like we took a really broad swath and had to approach. We just targeted certain prisons across the country that were sort of like the most egregious cases. But I encourage you to check out fracking sites or other sites in Kern with that EJ screen tool and try to see if you can find prisons nearby.
Okay, I'm asking because I'm about to go to an international meeting, and I want to touch base with some of the folks that are down in Southern California and are already doing work around the ports and some of the other issues to see how the prisons fit into the complex.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Catherine, did you have any other reactions or thoughts with regards to the questions or where you're coming from?
I don't know if she heard that. I really thank you very, very much, Candice. This is a real eye-opener and really expanded and empowered if I have an opportunity, that I have a greater sense that I know where to go or what to look for. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to find a video here, but I think you brought up reporters in Florida and trying to influence them to sort of take this issue on. Yeah, like I said in the beginning, of my presentation, it can be hard because it is for a wider public who doesn't sort of think about like environmental justice or these kinds of issues. It can always be like a sort of weird thing to bring up, like you know what I mean? That's why I say like it almost seems reasonable to prioritize environmental issues at the bottom of your list when you think about all of the human rights, just straight up human rights abuses that are going on in prisons. And sometimes it can be hard to convince reporters that like this issue is like kind of sexy. Like I could very easily see reporters being like, what does that have to do with anything like environmental stuff in prisons? Like what? So yeah, but I think it is an issue that is slowly starting to get more traction. And when you can tell people, like you said, you're in Florida, yeah, I was reading about just how they're using prisoners there to do recovery work for Irma already. That would be an intersection that I think might be interesting for journalists in Florida to sort of talk about more. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's slowly starting to gain traction. Yeah, I just think it's one of those things where, you have to give people examples of the fact that actually this intersection has killed people. And if we don't do anything about it, we'll continue to when we think about climate change. But, also on top of that, it's just really unfortunate that it's just another thing to heap on top of prisoners. Like on top of all of this other stuff, they're much more likely, they're disproportionately likely to get sick. One other thing we could talk about is a huge thing that's also being reported on is the fact that we have a booming, because of the prison boom in the 90s. Now, as a result of all of that tough on crime, that harsh sentencing that we have a very large, rapidly aging prison populace now. And so you have a lot of aging prisoners, elderly prisoners, who are, getting more and more medical, they have more and more medical issues. More and more of them are getting cancers. More and more of them are taking medications. One thing I reported on in terms of the heat issue, a lot of these prisoners are taking medications, especially elderly prisoners, that render them more vulnerable to heat. Some of them like beta blockers that kind of inhibit your ability to sweat. That makes you much more vulnerable, when you're exposed to temperatures that are over 100 degrees. And we're not just talking about, it gets hot in prisons. It's not just hotter. It's not just as hot as outside. It's hotter than outside, because it's this stone brick, the prisoners describe the ones where they have a brick wall as the brick sort of retaining the heat during the day and then releasing it at night. And so the nights are even worse because they can't sleep. They're just drenched in sweat because it actually sometimes gets hotter during the night than it does during the day. And then you combine that with the fact that they're on these medications that make them more vulnerable. And the ones who have died are at a combination of these things. Like I said, they've often just been transferred from units that had AC, and so their body's having a hard time acclimating to the extreme change in temperature. And then they're also taking these medications, so they just are the perfect storm, to be vulnerable to heat stroke. And those are the ones who go. Those are the ones who drop. And yeah, so that's the other thing to think about is that, yeah, we have a hugely, we have this huge prison populace. It's, the highest in the world. 2.3 million people behind bars. Everybody knows we incarcerate more. than anyone, and a huge percentage of that population is aging and becoming more and more in need of medical, very particular medical care, and that can also, tie into these issues as well.
It's like the prison industrial complex is the horcrux of the anti-love power structure. If we could bust it open, we would solve all the problems. It's got the intersection of so many things. We saw 13th at our church, and people learned that, we still have slave labor in prisons. Some get paid, some don't. It's like the new Jim Crow, and it's got so much going on in there. When we changed our psychiatric hospital structure a couple decades ago, all the people that were released from the hospitals and didn't have places to go, a lot of them ended up in prison. And people with mental illness in prison is a recipe for disaster. And I also kind of wonder, we have solitary confinement. The United Nations says maybe an hour a day, and we're doing it for weeks and months and forever until people are executed. And it's a really interesting issue to delve further into as Unitarian Universalists interested in inherent worth and dignity of all people, and all those other principles that we believe in. And I also just have kind of an idle thought. How many people in our aging population in prison have Alzheimer's? And what is the point of maintaining the sentence of someone who has no idea where they are or what they're doing? Let them go.
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to it, but that's another thing to look into. I'm sure that's an issue.
That's cruel and unusual punishment. Why am I here? Can you imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of like the spiritual aspect, I've just been thinking about this more as I've been on this call, and I also think, in terms of approaching it spiritually, not just about acknowledging the dignity and the worth of every human being. It's also about acknowledging and realizing that everybody, has the ability to change and transform. I mean, when we talk about this, honestly, so many of the prisoners that are locked up are in there on nonviolent drug crimes. But, you do have some people in there, and I talked to some men in my reporting who did have violent crimes, homicide, murder, guys who had committed those types of crimes. And I think it's also just important to think about the fact that these men, even though they have committed some of these crimes like that, can change and can transform. And I've met prisoners, this man who runs the prison ministry in Dallas, he talked about how his life has just been completely changed and transformed, especially, through the power of his faith. And I think it's important to remember that even though people have, committed those types of things, people can always change. People can always change themselves for the better. And, we can't bring back people who have been lost to those violent crimes. And I think that it's important to remember that even families of those who have lost, the family members of people who have lost loved ones to violent crimes like murder, even those families will say, they'll come out and they'll be against the death penalty, and they'll talk about, justice doesn't necessarily mean the death penalty for them. Like, I think Chicago is a good example of this. When we found out about the John Burge torture, a big movement there was the reparations movement. They demanded reparations, and I think that can provide us an interesting alternative for when we think about accountability and justice, like giving reparations to families who have been the victims of this, as a way of delivering justice, and not making it all about locking somebody up for the rest of their lives. Like we can think about transformative justice. We can think about what does it take to work with a person to actually change them, to actually get them to see the harm that they've done, and to try to get them to change, to try to get them to work with the victims and There are lots of models for transformative or restorative justice, they call it. A lot of them come from, and then this is interesting when we think about the environmental aspect, but honestly, a lot of transformative justice models, restorative justice models, come originally from indigenous people who practiced that in their tribes. You know, when there was a wrong done, they had these accountability systems. You know, they didn't have prisons, they didn't have jails. So yeah, I mean, it's just also something to think about when we think about restorative justice, just this idea that, you know, I don't think we should consider anybody as just lost or done for, or it's just important to remember, you know, there's always hope for people that they can change.
You know, this is Karen, and I guess I want to, you know, when I first saw this quote by Angela Davis, it has really affected me. And it's not a new thought, but the way it's stated here hits my gut in a new way somehow. And what I'm wondering, you know, I work with a lot of environmental folks around our UU congregations, and we're encouraging people, we're not encouraging, we're requiring people in UU congregations to stop being the philanthropists and the experts as a way of doing environmental justice work, and to really get uncomfortable, figure out how to make a connection with people in the frontline communities. And the equation in my mind is being made from some of the words that you've used, Candice, that we have whole nations and communities of people who are also imprisoned, who don't have a lot of choices around, you know, drinking poisonous water, etc. But that somehow our capitalist system makes me become more personally connected because of the way I benefit from the capitalist system. I'm really grasping because this has had a really strong emotional and spiritual resonance with me. And I'm wondering if anybody else has felt that. And I'm looking for a way to use this to help, again, reach to Unitarian Universalists who care about the environment, to touch a nerve that we effectively somehow cauterize. I need to be made uncomfortable, and then find again my resources for saying yes, and the next step is this, and the next right action is this, and the next right relationship to build is this. And I'm doing it because I love life, and I care about people. And look what our culture is doing. Look what our culture is doing. So I guess I don't have a real clear statement to make, except if somebody has an idea about how to write an article, or if there's a video or a piece that would really touch environmentalists who are Unitarian Universalists to help us go deep again with why we're doing environmental justice work. And this somehow really has touched a nerve that I step away from a little bit. I don't know. Earl, I'm wondering if you...
I'd like to let Irene speak first, and then I'll go, because I do have some answers around this.
Yeah.
I just have 2 sound bites for you, Karen. I'm taking away the word disposable. Is any piece of the web of life disposable? I think that word is not been used. You've used some words that we're all accustomed to hearing. Aren't used to hearing the word disposable. And I recommend to you lifting a piece out of a book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. If you just take the title.
Say it again.
Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. It's required reading at Harvard.
Thank
And
you.
it was written by somebody from my alma mater, University of Wisconsin. So let me just say, the point. Yeah. The point I want to make is that I think it's critical not to see this issue in isolation.
Yeah.
And I think part of not seeing it in isolation is that, as Candice mentioned earlier, often the people in prison come from the very same communities that I'm working with because they are fence line communities. Also, I've been working in this area with the black workers, and one of their big issues is ban the box, because so many of the people, when they come out, whether they have changed or not, find that they are unable to obtain employment and often are forced back into a life of crime because they don't see any alternatives. And so, when Candice was talking earlier about some of the things that she's seen done or have been done, I was reminded of a recent time when I was down talking with CARB, or testifying before CARB, which is California Air Resources Board. We had dozens of people from the community talking about, in this case, it was a big freight center, the Amazon type of thing where everything comes in and goes out again. And the Riverside, where we were, is terribly polluted, some of the worst air pollution in the United States. And so we had people coming up talking about how their parents had died prematurely, how their infants had died, how they had lost family members, how people were seriously ill. All of these other problems were discussed. Then we had a bunch of attorneys from Earth Justice and from the Coalition for Clean Air and a bunch of other groups talking about the legal aspects. And then we had some academics talking about the research, and then we had some activists like me who had been involved with the community, and I always try to put a moral perspective on it. The very same people we're talking about who are in prison are definitely being treated worse. Their situation is more abominable. But the people who live in Riverside, who are being poisoned every day, and it's always the same argument, oh, well, this is jobs. We need this center for jobs. Or, the health concerns are less than whatever. A part of this larger megatrix of recognizing or feeling that we've got a lot of surplus people. We've got a lot of people we don't need. And the people who are running the corporations and some of the others, they don't give a damn. They don't need these people anymore for consumers, and they don't need them for workers. And so when we think about this as a broader picture, then the question becomes, how are we in solidarity with the communities from which the prisoners come from? And so how do we increase voter registration? How do we do all of the other things to be able to pull the levers of power? Because that's why I asked the question about regulatory capture, because so often it is difficult to get the agencies to do anything because that's not what they're there for at this point. What they're there for is to follow their corporate masters and to be able to retire and immediately get a job in one of these corporations. So I appreciate all the additional information I've been given today and what I've learned, and I strongly recommend that when we discuss it with Unitarians who are into environmental justice or Unitarians who are environmentalists, that we keep it in this larger frame of how do we build this solidarity. And that cannot, in the same way Candice was saying, you really have to connect with prisoners' families and you have to do the same sort of thing. You can't do environmental justice sitting in Walnut Creek or Berkeley or whatever. You got to go out to where the people are and build relationship. Okay, sorry, I'm done preaching, but
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, I've heard the phrase fence line community as different from frontline community. Will anybody tell me what that's about?
Yeah, I can. the two may or may not be identical. Literally fence line communities means that they're on the fence of, or right outside the fence of a refinery or some other source of pollution. And frontline communities may not have a fence. They may have, they may be close to a port, for example, or some other place, or they're receiving pollution from a greater distance, or whatever it is. I've heard the two used pretty interchangeably, as we also use such things as underserved communities, disadvantaged communities, so forth and so on.
Thank you.
But you can make a distinction there.
Thank
Right. I think the primary difference is that it's just a lot closer. It's a metaphor.
Well,
Talking about, I can talk about Denton as an example of fence line, because in Denton, we literally have homes here in my town that are literally right across the street from a frac site. Like, you've got a house here, you cross the street, and there's a condenser tank here. And we have some shots in our film of some children who are Latino children jumping on their trampoline in their backyard, and we rack focus, and you can just see the condenser tank, which is at risk of exploding, can explode anytime, has exploded in Denton before, twice. We've had condenser tanks explode here, and you can just see it right there in the background of them jumping on their trampoline. And yeah. So that's pretty fence line. Yeah.
Well, I would venture to say, now that we're in this moment in the UU faith of increasing awareness of white supremacy culture, those of us who are white need to do everything we can to use the extra privileges we have to advance this issue. And I just think it's so important, talking about things being isolated. We have the social justice silo and the peace silo and the environmental silo and the, racial rights silos. This kind of brings a lot of things together in a very powerful way, and it's an opportunity to work with many different communities within our faith and outside our faith. I know one thing that blew my mind that I found out over the past few months when the Black Lives of UU was posting about the Black Mamas bailout campaign. I somehow had not been aware that if you can't afford bail, that's what it means. You don't get out until your trial. Naive, I guess, but that's just so unjust. Anyway.
And I mean, when you're pre-trial, you haven't been found guilty,
And you lose your job and your kids get taken away and life is ruined for a while. People commit suicide. It's just, I think it's kind of the crux of the divide in our nation today. We have the camp that is into punishment and paternalism and hierarchy and control and colonization. And then we have the camp that is into nurturing and reconciliation and reason and science. So that's what we have. That's what we're working with, combating something that's the opposite is so evil.
Well, I want to say, Candice, thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight and sharing so much information, and also some recommendations for how to actually address this issue, because it is systemic. It's hard to find the information. It's hard to find how people can, the people who could actually do something about it. And so, it's a very, very serious issue, and it's one that that takes apparently a lot of people, lawyers, researchers, journalists, communities to step up and to do something in a synchronized and heart-centered way, as we talked about, with it being just such a dehumanizing industry. So thank you so much to you and to also everyone for creating this space tonight and this conversation. And
thank you for inviting me. Honestly, that's really nice. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Amen and adieu. Bye-bye, all.
Thanks, everybody.
Buddy.
Bye.